Nice to see you all. Thank you all for coming along. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Davis from WMT, part of Moore Kingston Smith. For those of you who do know me, I'm still Peter Davis, and it's nice to have you back again. Okay. What I want to do for the next 20 minutes is talk to you a little bit about the landscape that we now live in with regards to all things tips, service charge and Tronc related. So you'll have heard Kate talk in the previous session a little bit about where we are and what the government has been doing. What I'm going to do is also a little bit of looking forward, very much in what we can expect as a direction of travel from the new Labour government on that. Okay. So let's just very quickly recap on where we are now. So the new legislation, which was passed by Parliament in 2023 under the previous government, has now taken effect from the 1st of October. So that is the Employment Allocation of Tips Act and the accompanying statutory code of practice. Amongst other things, what that legislation requires is that businesses must pay 100% every pound of the tips and service charges that their customers choose to pay to their workers. They must pay it to them within a defined time period, which is the end of the month following the month in which it was paid by the customer. So, for example, if I have dinner here tonight and pay the service charge, that money will need to be paid to people no later than the 31st of December. As a business, as an operator, I need to have written policies. I need to give those written policies to my team. My team now have certain rights to ask for information that they didn't beforehand. I must now take agency workers into account, whereas historically I probably wouldn't have considered them for a share of the money. Now, the legislation came in on the 1st of October. Just 4 days before that, the government, the new government, released some non-statutory guidance. That was disappointing in the sense that it was brief, didn't cover many of the issues and many of the points that had been flagged to the government, and in some areas actually went further than the underlying legislation. Okay. Now, bear in mind this guidance is non-statutory. That means it's not the law. So it has as much legal force as my wish list to Father Christmas. But what it does do is give an indication of the new government's view and the new government's direction of travel. And that is something we have to think about. Very briefly going to touch on agency workers. I know Kate mentioned it in her session earlier. I think the only thing I would say with agency workers particularly is, firstly, the new legislation is complicated, and secondly, it is also at the same time vague. There is a lot of shades of grey. We are not going to have a detailed knowledge of where the lines in the sand are for some time to come on this. The law is as it is. There is no new legislation going to come with regards to agency workers, so it will be over time when people like ACAS and people like employment tribunals start to hear cases that we will get an understanding. I think the key thing on agency workers is there is no one standard approach. Many of you will have taken different approaches within your properties to the question of agency workers, and by and large, that will probably be based on how significant a reliance you have on agency workers in your business. If you don't make much use of them, then actually this is probably not going to have a material impact. If, on the other hand, they are a very significant part of your business, it's got a really, really big impact. The risk that all businesses have is that agency workers have the same rights under the new legislation as directly employed team members. They have the same recourse to employment tribunals, and that recourse can be against the agency, but can also be against you if they are working in your business and your property. So you need to keep a watching brief on this. I would agree with Kate that not every agency worker is going to receive money under this new legislation, but if there are people who aren't or are going to receive less than a comparable directly employed member of staff, you need to have a good reason why, and you need to be clear with those agency workers as to why, and that's to head off any potential challenges or any problems further down the line on it. As I said, workers now have rights to information that they didn't beforehand. So you have an obligation from the 1st of October to keep certain records, and your workers are entitled to ask for that. Your workers are entitled to know how much money in what we call employer received tips, generally card grats and service charge. How much did you generate in the place in which I work? Your workers have a right to that. They are going to ask for it. We are already seeing a large number of queries from employees saying, I'm now entitled to know this and I want you to give it to me. And you must. You have to. Your workers are entitled to know how much of the money has been paid to me and my colleagues. And that will also lead them to understand if we've got people who work off-site in a non-public place of business, how much money is going to them collectively. Okay. Your workers must make a request in writing. You have 28 days to provide them with the information, and you have to do it. But the one thing that your team are not entitled to know is how much money do each of my colleagues earn, or enough information that would allow them to work out how much each of their colleagues earn. The Allocation of Tips Act is clear that it does not supersede and override the Data Protection Act. So you need to understand what information are my staff entitled to. You need to make sure that you provide that to them, either proactively or on request. But you also need to be careful that you don't release information that may lead you into trouble with GDPR and the Data Protection Act as well. Again, in the last session, Kate mentioned the new government's Employment Rights Bill. So this was something that had been trailed long before the election, that Labour had said that they were going to bring forward very quickly were they to be elected. Now, a lot of the fanfare and the publicity about that draft legislation was about zero-hour contracts, fire and rehire, access to the workplace for trade unions. What there wasn't a lot of attention on was that within the legislation, the government slipped in some changes to the Allocation of Tips Act. Okay? So just 11 days after it took effect, the new government has already given notice it is going to change and strengthen that legislation. Okay. The changes are not going to come in straight away. They will come in at the latest by the 1st of April 2026. Clearly this legislation has yet to go through Parliament, but given that the new government has a very substantial majority, and given that this legislation will be three-line whipped when it goes through Parliament, you can take it as read that this is going to happen. Okay. The amendment to the legislation requires there to be formal consultations with your staff about your tipping policies, and it will dictate how those consultations have to take place. It will require you to consult with trade unions if you recognise trade unions in your workplace. And bear in mind, other parts of the Employment Rights Bill may make it easier for unions to get recognition in your workplace. There will be a timeline that says you have to have a mandatory review at least once every 3 years. So for most people, what that will mean is the first one will be in the run-up to the 1st of October 2027. And the legislation sets out certain standards. It says that you have to take people's views into account. You have to make those views available in an anonymised format. And what it's really doing is putting much more emphasis on you listening to what your team have to say with that. So what is the government actually up to here? What are they trying to achieve by already announcing changes to the legislation? Okay, so the answer to an extent is in here. This is the impact assessment that the government published specifically about the changes to the Allocation of Tips Act. It's a very long document. Every single one of you should read it because it gives a very clear signpost. Labour's public position is that not only should workers receive all of the tips and service charges, that's already the law, but that they should control how those monies are managed and allocated. The aim of the amendment that the government has published is to say that workers must be actively involved in the development of tipping policies, and there must be genuine consideration of their input, and you will be under an obligation to encourage that input. In the impact assessment, the government say that their intention is, or their view is, that on average, 60% of your workforce need to be involved in that consultation. And the government say that the reason why they're doing this is that it will deliver fairer tip allocations. So, two things there. Number one, that suggests that the government believe that at the moment there is room for improvement, or that what we have is not fair. Okay. And that the legal framework in place, essentially they don't believe it will deliver what they want without making further changes to it. Okay. There is going to be a review of the entire legislation. That will be in 2029. Okay, with that. So clearly what the government are doing here is putting some changes in from 2026 that they believe will push things more in the direction that they want. And there is a cost estimate of how much all of this will cost you. So the government's central estimate for costs is about £59 million. But the range of their estimate is as high as £233 million. Now that is a phenomenal amount of money. And you might sit there and say, well, hang on, okay, this is admin, this is process, okay, that's a pain, that will cost us some money, but it can't get to £233 million for admin, surely. And the answer is no, it's not. So where are the government believing that more cost will come from? Okay, there are more clues in the impact assessment. Direct quote from the impact assessment. The new policy change is not expected to impact the overall value of tips transferred from employers to workers. It can't, because you're already having to transfer 100%. You can't give any more than 100%. Okay? And now legally, you can't give less than 100%. But the new policy could affect the distribution of tips, so how the cake is sliced. The government then go on to say this could particularly benefit workers in the scope of the policy who have less voice in the workplace. And later on in the impact assessment, the government make it abundantly clear by that they mean lower paid workers. It says that those workers could experience an increase in their incomes in return for receiving a higher share of tips. Lovely, that's very nice for them, but where's it going to come from? Other groups of workers could lose out. So the government acknowledge that actually this policy will create winners, but this policy will create losers as well. And the government are then crystal clear that what they want is a redistributive impact. Now, you may subscribe to that. You may think that's a positive, good thing. You may think that's a bad thing. But that is where we are. The government are saying we now want to influence things so that more of the money goes to our lower paid staff and less of the money goes to our senior staff. Now, clearly, if we turn around to our senior team members and say, we're going to have to give money that you're getting today, and we're going to have to give that to somebody else, those workers are not going to be happy. Those workers are going to say to you, well, great, okay, if you're going to do that, you need to make up my loss of income through higher wages, please. Okay? Otherwise, you know what? I'm off. That's how we start to get towards £233 million, okay? Because the government are very clearly flagging they will expect you to pick up the tab for it. So, 5 minutes left. I'm doing well here for time. Okay, what are our strategies? So, number one, no knee-jerk reactions. Okay, this is yet to come to pass. It is a signpost on the road, but we have not reached that final destination as yet. Stick to the principles that are in the legislation and the code of practice as they are today. Okay, do not start making changes because of what you think may happen, because if you do, in advance of it happening, there is a risk that those workers who may stand to lose out will be the ones who will go to an employment tribunal today, on the basis of the law as it stands. People do need, however, to be sensible. They do need to look at what they're doing and saying, is it reasonable? Is it proportionate? Have we skewed this to such an extent that our senior team are taking such a big proportion of the cake? You need to have a look at that. You need to be honest with yourselves about it. Proactively provide information to your team. Don't wait to be asked by your staff. Give them what they're entitled to up front. Why? Because look, we're embracing this. We're being open with you. We're being transparent. We have nothing to hide here. Because ultimately, what you need to be doing is building bridges and making friends in your teams on these issues over the next couple of years. You want your team to be of the view, actually, you know what? I feel that everything that's done here is fair. I've got no beef for that. I've got no grounds for complaint over it. That is absolutely a strategy that every operator now needs to look at. You won't make everyone happy, because life's not like that, and we have a finite sum of money. So don't aspire to making everyone happy. You'll never get there. The maxim that I would always work on is if most of your team are happy most of the time, that is the right place to be. But we need to make sure that we build those bridges and we get our teams happy with these things in advance. And that is going to be the best way to make sure that what you don't have is team members trying to pull the arrangements down or pick holes in them. I've got 3 minutes left. I've done well. So I would imagine I've got time for about 1 or 2 questions tops. Howard, go on.
Okay, excuse me jumping in there. One of the things that you said early on, Peter, about one of the things you said early on about the legislation was you have to pay out the tips in the month after they've been received. You had a very interesting example of a hotel where this is going to be something which needs to be focused on. Exactly what does that mean from an accounting point of view?
Okay, that's an answer that will take me more than 90 seconds, to be honest. Okay, so clearly, under the new legislation, the money that you receive has a use-by date. You need to understand when that use-by date is. You need to have documents and records that show when did we receive this money, when did we pay that money out, and then if we then have more money that we are going to keep until next month, as the legislation allows, that we've got a proper detailed trail of that. It's not a question I can answer in 90 seconds. I'm happy to speak to anyone during the lunch break on it, but the records and your internal accounts are going to be fundamental in showing you are doing what the law says you have to. time for one more, I think. No, lady at the back.
Hi. Do you foresee any issues in processing surplus trunk that we have now? So, for example, if we built up a bit of a pot pre-October that we would normally funnel into January and February, if we're overpaying essentially what was earned, do you foresee a problem with that?
Okay, so the new legislation is not retrospective. It does not apply to any money that you generated up to and including the 30th of September. So if you've generated some money before that date, which you've yet to pay out, the new legislation doesn't cover it, which means that if you want to say, we expect to have a big downturn in January and February, and we'd like to keep that money back so we can push that out to the team in January and February, you can do that with money that you generated before the 1st of October. The law is not retrospective. An employee's rights to information is not retrospective. An employee cannot ask you for information for a period earlier than the 1st of October. No, yeah, I'm getting signed signals. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for that. We are over in the smaller of the exhibition rooms. Do come along and say hello. Any further questions over lunch, come and see us. Myself, my colleague Andrew and my colleague Chris, who's around somewhere, we'd be delighted to talk. But thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the day.